He accused her of cheating and threw her out. 3 years later, he saw her holding a little boy who looked exactly like him. The skyline of New York shimmered through the penthouse windows as Andrew Winston stepped inside his home, loosening his tie with one hand while balancing his briefcase in the other. It had been another relentless day, back-to-back meetings, negotiations, and a last-minute investor call that had nearly derailed his schedule. His success had never been accidental. Every inch of his billion-dollar empire was carved through precision, sacrifice, and discipline. But tonight, something was off. As he stepped into the living room, he noticed the stillness. No music, no footsteps, not even the familiar hum of the city leaking in from the balcony. Only silence. Alice stood near the hallway, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Her light brown hair was pulled into a loose knot, and her eyes, usually warm, were now guarded. She didn't greet him. Instead, her gaze followed him as he set down his things and looked up, confused by her frozen stance. Then he said it. Words sharp, sudden, and irreversible. "You cheated on me." Alice blinked, stunned for a moment, and then exhaled slowly, as if she had been bracing for this. "Andrew," she said softly, "I didn't." But he had already made up his mind. The rage had been simmering for days. He had seen a message, just one, that he misread, misinterpreted, and never asked her about. His pride had already written the story, and he didn't want edits. "Don't lie to me," he snapped. "I saw what I needed to see. You don't have to say another word." She stepped closer, her hands trembling slightly. "You didn't even ask. You just decided." "I don't need your explanations," he replied coldly. "I want you gone." She paused, her throat tightening, but said nothing more. There were so many things she could have said, so many truths she could have thrown back at him, but she didn't. Instead, she walked into their bedroom, packed a small bag, and returned minutes later with her coat on. She stood in front of him, her eyes full of something more painful than anger, disbelief. "I loved you," she whispered. "I still do. But you don't trust me, and that's not something I can fight anymore." And then, without another word, she left. The door closed behind her with a soft finality. Andrew stood alone in the vast silence of the penthouse, his heartbeat thudding beneath the expensive fabric of his shirt. He didn't move. He didn't call after her. He didn't even sit down. His whole life had been built on never looking back, and tonight, he convinced himself he was doing the same. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Alice was already carrying the weight of a life he would one day regret walking away from. A small heartbeat had started inside her only weeks before. But now, she was gone. And so was everything he thought he understood about love, loyalty, and truth. 3 years passed, and Andrew Winston never once spoke her name again. In the whirlwind of mergers, board meetings, and cross-continental flights, he buried the memory of Alice beneath polished reports and strategic victories. The penthouse remained pristine, untouched by any personal detail, no photos, no mementos, no reminders of what had once lived there with him. He told himself he had made the right decision, that betrayal didn't deserve reflection. And yet, sometimes, late at night when the city grew quiet and even the lights of Manhattan dimmed behind the glass, he felt something he couldn't name. A hollow echo in a home built for two. It was early spring in New York, crisp air lingering with the scent of rain, when Andrew's world shifted without warning. He had just stepped out of a black car in front of a midtown hotel, preparing for a private fundraising dinner. His assistant trailed behind him with a clipboard and phone, rattling off the list of guests and updates, but he barely listened. His attention was drawn instead to a woman standing across the street, near the curb, her arms stretched upward as she tried to hail a taxi. The sight struck him like a physical blow. It was her. Alice. Her hair was longer now, still light brown, tied in a loose braid that rested on her shoulder. She wore a simple coat and held a small child on her hip, a boy, no older than 3, bundled in a blue sweater and jeans, with dark hair and unmistakably blue eyes. His eyes. Andrew's breath caught in his throat. He didn't move. He couldn't. The chaos of the street faded, and all he could hear was the sound of blood rushing in his ears. The child turned slightly, looking around curiously, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met, those same eyes Andrew saw in the mirror every morning. It was impossible. No, it wasn't. It was real, and he knew it with terrifying clarity. The taxi pulled up. Alice adjusted the child on her arm and opened the door. She hadn't seen him yet. Andrew took a step forward, instinct rising in his chest, but stopped himself. What would he say? What could he say? As she turned her head, their eyes locked. The noise of the city fell away. She froze for half a second, the boy's head resting against her shoulder, then looked away. Not coldly. Not angrily. Just, deliberately. Like someone who had made peace with being unseen. She stepped into the taxi, pulled the door closed, and a moment later, the cab disappeared into traffic. Andrew stood motionless, not noticing the confused glance from his assistant, not hearing the phone still ringing. He had seen his son. A son he never knew existed. A child with his eyes, his features, his blood. And Alice, the woman he had cast out of his life without a single question, had been living with that truth every day. The dinner went on without him. He cancelled all appointments that night and returned home in silence, hands trembling slightly as he poured himself a drink and stared at the skyline that had once made him feel powerful. Now it meant nothing. He had built an empire on control. But that moment on the street had shattered it. Because the truth, the one thing he never asked for, had found him anyway. And it was just 3 feet tall, with blue eyes and a quiet gaze that had already begun to haunt him. The following morning, Andrew sat in his office, but for the first time in years, the numbers in front of him meant nothing. Spreadsheets, charts, and emails blurred together into a white noise that he couldn't decipher. His mind kept circling back to one thing, the boy. The child he had seen in Alice's arms. His son. Every time he blinked, he saw the same blue eyes staring back at him, eyes that mirrored his own so perfectly, it had shaken him to his core. The realization settled heavily over him, pressing against his ribs like a weight he hadn't prepared to carry. He had a son. And he had never been told. He didn't call Alice right away. Part of him feared she wouldn't pick up. The other part didn't trust himself to say the right thing. What was the right thing after 3 years of silence and absence? After accusations that had driven her away? He had been so sure of himself, so convinced she had betrayed him, that he never once gave her the chance to speak. That certainty now felt like the most dangerous kind of blindness. By evening, he found himself standing outside her apartment building. He had hired someone to find her, not out of malice, but out of desperation. It wasn't hard. She hadn't left the city. She hadn't even left Manhattan. While he had been closing deals in Tokyo and Berlin, she had been raising a child just blocks away. He stood by the curb, watching the entrance, unsure of whether to knock or just leave. But before he could decide, the door opened. Alice stepped outside with a grocery bag in one arm and her son holding onto the other. The boy walked unsteadily but confidently, talking about something in a tiny, excited voice that Andrew couldn't quite hear from across the street. Alice bent down, smiling at something he said, brushing a loose strand of hair from his face, and Andrew couldn't move. There was something breathtaking in how simple it looked. A life he had missed. A life she had built. Without thinking, he crossed the street. Alice looked up as he approached. Her expression shifted the moment she recognized him. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in guarded surprise. She stood upright, placing a steady hand on the boy's shoulder as Andrew came to a stop just a few feet away. "Hi," he said, his voice unsteady. She didn't reply at first. She looked him over, then looked down at her son. The boy clung to her leg now, curious but cautious. "I saw you yesterday," he continued, struggling to find words that didn't feel like excuses. "I didn't know, Alice. I didn't know he existed." Her face remained still, her voice calm. "You never asked." There it was. The truth, laid bare. Not bitter. Not cruel. Just honest. And it hit harder than any accusation could have. She had carried the burden of silence for 3 years while he had lived in ignorance, protected by his own certainty. "I want to meet him," Andrew said. "I want to know him." Alice hesitated, then crouched down beside her son. "Ollie," she said gently, "this is Andrew. He's someone I used to know." Ollie looked up, wide-eyed, then nodded solemnly before hiding behind her coat. Andrew didn't push. He didn't kneel or reach out. He simply waited, letting the boy's comfort lead. Alice rose again. "I don't know what you're expecting," she said. "But this isn't something you can walk into like it's a deal you forgot to sign. He's not a project. He's a person." "I know," Andrew said softly. "And I'm not here for control. I'm here because I want to earn a place. If you'll let me." Alice studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded once. "You can come by tomorrow. 5 o'clock. He likes books and dinosaurs. Don't be late." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and led her son down the block, disappearing into the city's blur of motion. Andrew stood there long after they were gone, replaying every second, every word. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing a deal, a headline, or a win. He was chasing something real. Something he had once thrown away. And now, it was time to see if it could ever be rebuilt. Andrew arrived 10 minutes early the next evening, standing outside Alice's apartment with a small paper bag in one hand and nerves settling like stones in his chest. He had no idea what a 3-year-old liked beyond the brief mention of books and dinosaurs. Inside the bag were 2 carefully chosen picture books, one about a triceratops and another with flaps that revealed animals hiding in the forest. He had never bought a toy before. He had never read a bedtime story. The weight of everything he had missed pressed heavily on him as he stood in the hallway staring at her door. When it opened, it surprised him how normal everything looked. The apartment was modest and warm, filled with soft light and the smell of pasta and garlic. Alice wore jeans and a sweater, her hair down this time, and though her eyes were still cautious, her voice was steady. "Ollie's just finishing his snack," she said. "You can come in." He stepped inside slowly, taking in the space. There were scattered toys in one corner, a row of tiny shoes by the door, and a worn but clean couch with a blanket draped over the side. It was a home that had clearly grown around a child. And somehow, it made him feel both deeply welcome and completely out of place. Then he saw him. Oliver was sitting at the kitchen table, his feet swinging beneath the chair, holding a small cup of juice with both hands. When he looked up and saw Andrew, he paused, not afraid, just uncertain. Andrew crouched down a little to be on his level and gently held out the bag. "Hi, Oliver," he said. "I brought you something. Books. Your mom said you like dinosaurs." Oliver didn't take the bag right away, but his curiosity flickered. After a glance at Alice, who gave the slightest nod, he got down from the chair, walked over, and accepted it. He pulled out the first book and flipped through it, mumbling softly, "That's a stegosaurus," before walking back to the couch and sitting with it on his lap. Andrew didn't follow him. He sat on a nearby chair, watching, unsure what came next. Alice came into the room, sat across from him, and handed him a glass of water. "He'll probably ask you a million questions once he gets used to you," she said. "He does that with people he likes." Andrew smiled faintly. "That would be an improvement. Right now, I think he sees me as some guy who brought paper." Alice's expression softened just enough to make the room feel less tense. He's cautious. Like me. There was a moment of silence, not uncomfortable, just thick with history. Then Alice looked at him and asked the question he'd expected but dreaded. Why did you believe I cheated on you? He met her eyes, the apology already written across his face. Because I was afraid. Because I saw something I didn't understand, and instead of asking, I reacted. I chose anger over trust. I thought I was protecting myself, but I destroyed everything instead. She nodded slowly. You didn't just destroy me, Andrew. You left him without a father. You don't get to pretend that didn't happen. I know, he said. That's why I'm here. Not to erase the past. Just to be part of his future. They both looked over at Oliver, who was now reading aloud to himself in a small, confident voice, mispronouncing words but too focused to care. Alice rose and walked over to him, adjusting the collar of his shirt and kissing the top of his head. We read 3 books before bed, she said over her shoulder. If you want to stay, that's one of the rules. Andrew stood up, heart pounding, and nodded. I'd like that. They sat together on the couch, with Oliver nestled between them, his tiny voice narrating a world filled with dinosaur adventures and hidden owls behind tree flaps. And for the first time in years, Andrew didn't feel powerful or accomplished. He felt small, humbled, and deeply grateful to be allowed into that space. When it was time for bed, Oliver reached out without thinking and let Andrew help him down. It was a small gesture. But to Andrew, it was everything. Before he left, Alice stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching him closely. Same time next week? He nodded. Or sooner, if you'll let me. She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, she said, we'll see. The door closed gently behind him, and Andrew stood in the hallway for a long time, holding on to the quiet sound of his son's voice still echoing in his head. He hadn't earned forgiveness. Not yet. But for the first time, he felt like he might be starting to deserve a place in the story. Over the next few weeks, Andrew returned to Alice's apartment regularly, always on time, never empty-handed, but never trying to impress. He brought puzzles, coloring books, and once a small plush dinosaur that Oliver insisted on taking to bed that very night. Each visit began with hesitation and ended with something warmer. Oliver, once quiet and wary, now waited by the window when it got close to 5 o'clock, asking his mother every few minutes, is he coming today? The shift was slow, but it was real, and Andrew felt it in the way the boy started to pull his hand without fear or lean against his side during stories. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, just the quiet accumulation of trust, one evening at a time. Andrew also began to stay a little longer. He would help clean up after dinner, listen to Oliver's retellings of his day at preschool, and sometimes, when Alice allowed it, put him to bed. At first, he stumbled through bedtime routines, unsure of where the pajamas were kept or which story Oliver preferred. But Alice was patient, watching from the doorway, and gradually stepped back, letting Andrew figure it out. And he did. He memorized the rhythm of Oliver's routines, learned which corner of the blanket to tuck first and which lullaby to hum softly as the boy drifted off. One night, after putting Oliver to sleep, Andrew walked into the kitchen where Alice was making tea. She handed him a cup without asking and leaned against the counter, arms crossed but not defensive. He watched her for a moment, then said quietly, I want to be his legal father. I want to be on his birth certificate. Alice didn't respond immediately. She stared at the floor, processing, her fingers tightening slightly around her mug. You weren't there when he was born. Or when he got sick that winter and I was alone at the ER, terrified. Or when he said his first word. I did all of it by myself, and not because I wanted to. I didn't have a choice. I know, Andrew said. And nothing I do now will change that. But I'm here. I'm not walking away this time. Alice looked up, her expression more tired than angry. It's not just about showing up now. It's about staying when it's inconvenient. When he's older and asks hard questions. When he wants to know why you weren't there. I'll answer every one, Andrew said. Honestly. And I'll never let him believe he wasn't wanted. Even if I didn't know about him, I want him now, with everything I have. She nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. We'll need a lawyer. There's paperwork. A court hearing. I've already made the appointment, he said. I just need your consent. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the air between them filled with a strange mix of grief and progress. Then Alice did something unexpected. She reached for a folder sitting on the counter and handed it to him. I kept his original documents. I don't know why. Maybe part of me hoped you'd ask someday. Andrew took it with trembling hands. Inside were hospital records, immunization forms, and a tiny footprint pressed into a birth certificate that read, Mother, Alice Taylor, and under, Father, a blank space. I don't deserve to be in this, he said quietly. Alice met his eyes. Then earn it. 2 weeks later, they stood side by side in a family courtroom. Oliver sat with a social worker coloring quietly, unaware of the significance of the moment. When the judge asked Alice to confirm that she wanted to add Andrew to the birth certificate, she didn't hesitate. I do, she said. Because he's not the same man who sent me away. When the judge turned to Andrew, he cleared his throat before speaking. I failed once, he said. But I won't fail again. I want to be his father in every sense. Not because the law says I can. Because I love him. And I'll prove that every day I'm given the chance. The judge signed the papers. It wasn't dramatic. No one clapped. But Andrew felt the gravity of that signature like a vow. He didn't walk out of the courthouse feeling victorious. He walked out feeling humbled, overwhelmed by how much he had to make up for, and how much more he was willing to give. That night, Oliver crawled into his lap with the birth certificate in his hands and said, Mommy said you're my dad now. Andrew smiled, holding him closer. I always was, buddy. We just needed the paper to catch up. Summer arrived softly, with long evenings and sunlit mornings that felt like a second chance. By now, Andrew had become a part of Oliver's daily life, no longer a visitor, but a presence. He picked him up from preschool twice a week, learned which snacks he liked best, and could recite entire pages of Oliver's favorite bedtime books without looking. It was no longer strange for the boy to reach for his hand or call out, Daddy, in public. Each time he heard it, Andrew felt something quiet and aching press into his chest. He had missed the first years of his son's life, but now he was building something real, something they both could stand on. Alice remained cautious, but not distant. Their conversations grew longer, lighter, though still lined with unspoken boundaries neither of them dared cross. They coordinated schedules, shared small parenting victories, and began to build a rhythm that felt more like family than formality. Sometimes, when Oliver had a cold or refused to sleep, they navigated it together, side by side, as if the years between them hadn't cracked everything open. On one such night, when Oliver woke crying from a nightmare, Andrew had been the one to soothe him. He held him close, whispering calm until the boy's breath evened, and when he looked up, he found Alice standing quietly in the doorway. She said nothing, but her eyes softened in a way he hadn't seen in years. That night, she didn't send him home right away. Instead, they both sat in the living room, talking quietly while Oliver slept, their voices low, not because they had to whisper, but because something about the moment didn't allow for noise. Despite the peace, something still lingered beneath the surface, unfinished, unsettled. Andrew knew it wasn't just about Oliver anymore. It was about what had been lost between him and Alice. One evening, as they packed away art supplies after a messy craft session, Andrew asked quietly, "Did you ever think of telling me? After you left?" Alice didn't answer right away. She wiped a streak of dried glue off the table, then looked at him. "I thought about it every day for a while," she said. "But I told myself if you wanted to know the truth, you would have asked before accusing me." I had to protect myself. And him. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. I didn't just fail you. I failed him, before I even knew he existed. She sighed, her voice gentler now. You're here. You show up. That counts for something. But trust, it takes time. The next weekend, Alice invited Andrew to join them on a short trip to the coast. Nothing elaborate, just a 2-day stay at a quiet beach town, the kind with ice cream stands and soft sand that clung to your skin. Andrew hesitated at first, unsure if it was a test or something more. But when Oliver overheard and shouted, "Beach with Daddy," it felt like a decision had already been made. They drove down in separate cars but arrived together. The motel was small but clean, and the ocean was just steps away. Oliver ran wild, laughing and splashing in the shallow water, pulling both of them along in his joy. They built sandcastles, collected shells, and roasted marshmallows over a small fire pit. For the first time, the three of them moved together not like broken pieces trying to fit, but like something whole. But the second day brought an unexpected scare. In the late afternoon, while Andrew and Alice were distracted folding towels, Oliver wandered too far down the shoreline chasing a crab. When they realized he was gone, a sickening panic rose in Andrew's chest. They split up, shouting his name, their voices strained with fear. After 10 terrifying minutes, Andrew spotted him in the distance, sitting calmly on a rock, watching the waves. He ran to him, dropped to his knees, and pulled him into his arms, holding him so tightly that the boy squirmed and asked, "Daddy, why are you crying?" Alice found them moments later and froze at the sight, Andrew on his knees in the sand, tears on his cheeks, Oliver safe in his arms. She knelt beside them, her hands on both of their backs, and they stayed like that for a long time, not speaking. The fear had shaken something loose, some wall that had stood between them since the day she walked out of his life. That evening, after Oliver was asleep, Andrew sat outside on the small balcony of their motel room. Alice joined him without speaking, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. The night air was cool and smelled of salt and firewood. He looked over at her, eyes tired but open. "I don't think I've ever been more afraid than I was today." Alice nodded slowly. "Neither have I. I don't ever want to feel that way again," he said. "Then don't disappear," she replied. "From him. From this." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Not again." She didn't answer. She just looked out toward the waves and, after a moment, leaned her shoulder slightly against his. Not fully. Not finally. But it was enough. And for the first time in years, Andrew didn't feel like someone rebuilding what he lost. He felt like someone finally stepping into something worth keeping. As autumn settled in, the colors of the city softened into amber and gold, and Andrew's life took on a new kind of structure, one he hadn't known he craved. The early mornings were no longer about conference calls and strategy meetings, but about packing lunches, helping Oliver into his little jacket, and making sure his shoes were on the correct feet. On weekdays, Andrew picked him up from preschool, sometimes taking him to the park, sometimes to the bookstore, where Oliver would run his hands along the shelves and proudly choose picture books far above his reading level. There was something sacred in those routines, something grounding. It wasn't glamorous, and that's what made it feel real. He had quietly moved into an apartment just 2 blocks from Alice's place, a decision that had felt at first like a practical step but quickly became much more. It allowed him to be part of Oliver's day-to-day life without disruption. He wasn't an occasional presence anymore. He was a constant. Oliver now expected him to be there, asked for him when he wasn't, and told stories at dinner about things they'd done together. Alice no longer seemed surprised by this. At first, she had been wary of how easily their son bonded with Andrew, but now, she watched the two of them together with something close to peace. There were still boundaries, though. Andrew and Alice lived separately, operated independently, and avoided conversations that veered too far into the past. But there was less tension now, less effort in simply being around each other. They could talk over coffee without suspicion, joke in front of Oliver without awkward pauses, and occasionally linger after bedtime in quiet companionship. One evening, as they worked on a preschool project involving glitter and glue, Alice glanced at Andrew and asked, not unkindly, "Do you ever miss your old life?" He looked at her, considering the question. "I thought I would," he said. "But no. Not like this." "You were good at it," she said. "I was successful," he replied. "But I don't think I was ever happy." Alice didn't respond right away. She focused on cutting a piece of blue construction paper into a clumsy star. Then she said softly, "Neither was I." It was moments like that which built something new between them, not romance, not quite yet, but trust. The kind that grows quietly, brick by brick, where something once burned down. That trust deepened the night Oliver got a fever. He cried through the night, his skin hot, his body restless. Alice called Andrew just after midnight, and he came immediately. Together they sat beside his bed, taking turns with cold cloths, reading to him when he could listen, holding him when he couldn't sleep. At one point, Andrew looked over and saw Alice, eyes red from exhaustion, brushing Oliver's hair gently off his forehead. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For everything." She looked at him, and instead of anger or pain, there was only weariness and something like understanding. "We're here now," she said. "That's what matters." By morning, Oliver's fever broke, and the three of them collapsed on the couch together in a tangle of blankets and relief. It was chaotic, unplanned, and strangely perfect. Alice fell asleep first, her head resting against Andrew's shoulder, and though he didn't dare move, something inside him finally settled. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged. From that point on, things began to shift, not drastically, not with big declarations, but in small, quiet ways. Alice stopped setting limits on how often Andrew could stay. She invited him to join them for dinner without hesitation. He fixed the leaky sink in her kitchen and replaced the batteries in the smoke detector without being asked. She bought extra cereal he liked. One afternoon, Oliver looked up from his drawing and asked, "Why doesn't Daddy live with us?" The question hung in the air for a long moment. Andrew opened his mouth to speak, but it was Alice who answered first. "Sometimes grown-ups need time to figure out where home really is." Oliver nodded as if that made perfect sense and returned to his drawing. Later that evening, Andrew stood in the doorway, watching Alice read to their son before bed. He felt something he hadn't dared let himself feel in years, hope. Not the kind rooted in fantasy or desperation, but the kind that grows slowly, watered by forgiveness, steadied by patience. He didn't know what would happen next. But he knew this, he wasn't walking away. Not now. Not ever again. The first snow of winter came early, blanketing the city in white and quieting everything under a soft hush. It was just days before Christmas, and the streets were lined with lights, trees and windows, and the smell of cinnamon and pine drifting from corner bakeries. Oliver was more excited than ever, waking up each morning asking if it was the real Christmas yet, and watching the sky for reindeer. Andrew had helped him hang decorations at both homes, but it was Alice's apartment that truly felt like the heart of it all, warm, full of laughter, and strung with mismatched ornaments made from popsicle sticks and glitter. On Christmas Eve, Alice surprised Andrew by inviting him to spend the evening with them. Not just to drop off presents or join for an hour, but to stay, to be part of it all. She didn't use big words or offer explanations. She simply said, "Oliver wants you here." And Andrew had nodded, not trusting himself to say more. They baked cookies that afternoon, flour dusting every surface and sticking to Oliver's cheeks like snow. Alice played old holiday records, humming softly as she stirred batter and handed out pieces of dough. Andrew watched her move through the kitchen, graceful even in the chaos, and felt that same quiet ache in his chest, the one that reminded him how much had been lost, and how much he had been given another chance to hold. That night, after dinner and stories, after Oliver had carefully placed a cookie and a note for Santa near the window, they tucked him into bed together. He was too excited to fall asleep, but they stayed anyway, sitting on either side of him until his eyes finally fluttered closed. Alice rose first and turned off the light, and Andrew followed her into the living room, where the glow of the tree lit the room in soft gold. There was silence between them for a few minutes, not heavy, not uncomfortable, just filled with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Alice turned to him, her expression unreadable. "He wrote a letter to Santa this year," she said. "But he didn't let me read it. Said it was secret." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "Did you find it?" She nodded, then reached behind one of the ornaments on the tree and pulled out a small folded paper. She handed it to him without saying anything more. He opened it slowly, his hands trembling slightly, and read the large, uneven letters, "Dear Santa, I love Mommy and Daddy. Can we all live in one house so I don't have to miss anybody anymore? I've been really good." Andrew didn't speak. He stared at the note for a long time, the words blurring slightly. When he looked up, Alice was watching him, not with pressure or expectation, but with something far more fragile, openness. She wasn't asking. She wasn't rushing. She was simply letting him feel it, letting the moment belong to him as much as her. "I don't want to miss anything else," he said finally. "Not a day. Not another year. If it's too soon, I'll wait. But I'm not going anywhere." She didn't answer with words. Instead, she stepped closer, gently took the note from his hands, and placed it back on the tree. Then she looked up at him and, for the first time since the day he lost her, smiled in a way that reached all the way to her eyes. That night, Andrew didn't leave. He stayed. Not just on the couch. Not just for the sake of a tradition or for Oliver's happiness. He stayed because something had shifted, not in some grand, dramatic way, but in the quiet rhythm of two people who had finally learned to forgive, to trust, and to choose each other again. In the morning, Oliver ran into their room shouting that Santa had come. He dove onto the bed, laughing, tugging at the blankets with tiny hands. Andrew and Alice opened their eyes at the same time, side by side, and looked at their son, their reason, their miracle, their second chance. Outside, the world was still dusted in snow, but inside, it was warm and filled with something rare and unshakable. They hadn't just found their way back. They had built something better than what had come before. Not perfect. Not simple. But real. And this time, they were holding on to it with everything they had. The ending of this story is quiet, but deeply powerful, because it doesn't chase perfection, it embraces truth. What makes it satisfying isn't a dramatic twist or a fairy tale reunion, but the slow, honest return of love built on vulnerability, patience, and change. Andrew's transformation isn't sudden. He doesn't fix everything overnight, nor is he instantly forgiven. Instead, he earns his way back, not with words, but through presence, consistency, and humility. Alice, too, shows immense strength, not just for surviving what she went through, but for allowing her heart to open again when she had every reason to guard it. And Oliver becomes the soul of the story, not because he asks for anything extraordinary, but because his simple desire, to have his parents close, reminds them of everything that truly matters. This ending works because it's rooted in reality. It doesn't pretend that pain disappears or that broken trust vanishes. Instead, it shows how people can grow through it. That healing is possible when both sides are brave enough to step back in, even after deep hurt. And that sometimes, the most unexpected second chances are the ones that finally bring you home. To me, that's the best kind of happy ending, earned, grounded, and full of quiet hope.